Samuel Green, a 72-year-old retired judge, stood outside the Blue Note Jazz Lounge in the heart of Buckhead, Atlanta's affluent district. The evening air was cool against his skin, and the faint sound of jazz mingled with the hum of luxury cars and high-end boutiques around him. Samuel, a man of wisdom and grace, had declined an invitation to join his grandson inside, preferring to let the young law student shine on his own. He waited in silence, adjusting his cufflinks as his silver hair caught the light, blending effortlessly into the vibrant surroundings. But his peaceful moment was shattered when a squad car idled across the street, its occupants watching him. As the passenger window rolled down, the officer's gaze locked with his, cold and calculating. Before he could process, two young officers, David White and Carl Brown, strolled over with an air of arrogance. "Old man like you don't belong here," one sneered, his voice dripping with venom. The situation escalated quickly. Samuel, unbothered, calmly explained he was waiting for his grandson. Yet the officers weren't interested in explanations. They mocked him, calling him a high and mighty fool. They accused him of loitering, an offense that was nothing more than a thinly veiled excuse for their harassment. The beatdown came swiftly, insults, shoves, and even a punch to his face. His tailored suit became stained with blood. Despite the physical abuse, Samuel kept his composure, refusing to show fear. And then, with incredible poise, he did something unexpected. He didn't reach for a lawyer. Instead, he made one phone call, not to a local attorney, but to the Supreme Court. What seemed like a random act would soon send shockwaves through the entire system, setting in motion a series of events that would change everything. Samuel wasn't just any man, and the officers had no idea who they were dealing with. Their fate was about to take a dark and irreversible turn. The video of Samuel Green's unjust arrest spread like wildfire across the internet. Eric, Samuel's grandson, had been quick to capture the entire ordeal on his phone. What started as an ordinary evening for a 72-year-old retired judge had turned into a public spectacle. Eric, trembling with anger and fear, had posted the video online within minutes of the incident. It didn't take long for the video to go viral. What began as a single post shared by a few friends exploded into a full-scale public outcry. Across social media platforms, hashtags like #JusticeForSamuel and #EndPoliceBrutality began trending. The video, raw, unfiltered, and chilling, showed Samuel, bloodied and humiliated, being shoved into a police car, while the two officers, David White and Carl Brown, stood with smug smiles on their faces. Their actions, the disrespect, the utter cruelty, it was impossible to ignore. People across the country felt the sting of injustice. Within hours, Samuel's story made headlines. News outlets reported the abuse, and outrage quickly spread beyond social media, filling the streets with protesters demanding justice. In every major city, the call for accountability rang out. The public didn't just stand with Samuel Green. They stood against the corruption and violence perpetuated by those sworn to protect them. But it wasn't just the public's voice that rallied in support of Samuel. Maya Ross, a fierce and unrelenting lawyer, had been a close friend of Samuel's for years. She had witnessed the judge's passion for justice firsthand, and she wasn't about to let this despicable act slide. Maya's phone rang off the hook as she scrambled to gather the evidence and prepare her strategy. Samuel's case wasn't just about a wrongful arrest. It was about shining a light on a broken system. The more she looked into the incident, the more she uncovered. David White and Carl Brown had a history of violence and abuse. This wasn't an isolated event. They had been involved in multiple complaints of racial profiling and brutality, but somehow they had managed to avoid any consequences. Maya knew this would be her battle, her chance to take down not just the officers, but the entire corrupt structure they represented. While Samuel sat locked in a holding cell, bruised and battered, his resolve remained unbroken. The harsh fluorescent lights above him flickered, casting long shadows across the cold concrete walls. He sat, back straight, eyes unwavering. His body ached, but his mind raced. This wasn't the first time he'd been forced to fight against an unjust system. He'd done it from the courtroom bench, and now, in the face of his own suffering, he would do it again. His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp clang of the cell door. The officer at the desk was glaring at him through the small window. "Phone call?" he muttered, throwing the receiver onto the small table in front of Samuel. Samuel's hand trembled slightly as he picked up the phone. He knew who he needed to call. A friend, a longtime ally, Chief Justice Evelyn Adams. "Evelyn," Samuel's voice was steady, despite the pain in his chest. "I need you to listen carefully. These officers, David White and Carl Brown, have crossed a line, and I won't let them get away with it." Evelyn's voice, sharp and commanding as always, came through the line. "What's happened, Samuel? What's going on?" "They arrested me. They've beaten me. They've humiliated me, Evelyn. But I'm not just fighting for myself. I'm fighting for every man, woman, and child who's been subjected to this system of corruption and abuse." There was a long pause. Evelyn had known Samuel for decades, and she understood his fight better than anyone. "I'm getting you out of there," she said, her voice resolute. "I'll call in favors. I'll make sure the world knows the truth." "No, Evelyn, this isn't just about me. This is bigger. I need you to use your position. I need you to call in the Supreme Court. I want a hearing on this. I want the whole country to see what's happening here. This needs to stop now." Evelyn's breath caught on the other end of the line. The Supreme Court was no small matter, but Samuel was no ordinary man. He had once sat among the greatest legal minds in the nation, and his voice carried weight. "Consider it done," she said after a moment, her voice filled with determination. "We'll make this public. We'll make sure those officers never see the light of day again." As Samuel hung up the phone, a surge of hope and resolve flooded through him. He was no longer just a retired judge trapped in a holding cell. He was a man on a mission, and this fight was just beginning. Outside, the protests continued to grow. The tension in the air was palpable, the weight of the collective anger threatening to explode. The public, now fully aware of the injustice that had been done to Samuel, was demanding answers. But Samuel's case was more than just a call for justice. It was a wake-up call, a rallying cry against the deep-rooted corruption and bias that had plagued law enforcement for far too long. David White and Carl Brown, oblivious to the storm they had unleashed, were still riding high on their false sense of power. But as the public pressure mounted, cracks began to form in their smug facades. The officers, who once believed they could operate with impunity, suddenly found themselves in the crosshairs of an enraged nation. The weight of the video evidence, the growing protests, and the legal machinery now in motion, it was all too much. The phone calls were made. The news stories spread. Maya Ross, tirelessly working behind the scenes, had already begun to pull together the legal framework to take down the officers and anyone else complicit in this corrupt system. But it wasn't just the officers who needed to be held accountable. It was the people who allowed this kind of behavior to fester and thrive. Samuel knew this, and he was determined to see it through. As the day stretched into night, Samuel's fate seemed to be hanging by a thread. Yet, in the quiet of his cell, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The first strike had been made, and this time the forces of justice were on his side. But as the first glimmer of dawn began to peek through the bars of his cell, he knew this fight was far from over. The real battle was just beginning, and he wasn't going to let anyone, or anything, stop him from bringing justice to the forefront. The storm that was brewing outside was a storm that Samuel Green had been waiting for his whole life. And now it was here. The weight of Samuel Green's arrest began to settle heavily on the shoulders of the corrupt officers involved. David White and Carl Brown, once smug and untouchable, now found themselves in the center of a storm they never expected. And Captain John Miller, their superior, had seen the writing on the wall. The world was watching. Public opinion was swiftly turning against them, and the last thing they wanted was for the truth to come out. So they did what many desperate men do. They tried to cover their tracks. Late at night, under the guise of routine, David and Carl snuck into the impound lot where Samuel's car had been towed. With swift, practiced motions, they planted a bag of drugs in the trunk. They knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't their first time bending the law. Samuel Green, the retired judge, had been their perfect target, someone they could manipulate to cover up their own corruption. "Let's just drop this in the back," David said, his voice low, his eyes darting around nervously. "If anyone finds it, it'll be on him, not us." Carl gave a grim nod, slipping the bag of cocaine into the trunk. They knew this was their only chance to avoid prison, their only escape from the tight noose of justice that was slowly closing in on them. As Carl slammed the trunk shut, both officers stepped back, their expressions hardened with the belief that they had won. But the next morning, something unexpected happened. Samuel's lawyer, Maya Ross, was not easily fooled. She had seen corruption in every corner of the legal world, and she was determined to bring these officers down. As the public's outrage grew, Maya sifted through every detail of the case, demanding all available evidence, speaking to witnesses, and digging into the history of the officers involved. And what she found in the hours of security footage from the impound lot was damning. A hidden camera, one that the officers had assumed was off, had captured the entire incident. Every moment, every word. David White and Carl Brown planting the drugs. The tape was crystal clear, showing the officers' deceitful actions, their arrogance, and their false justification for what they were doing. Maya watched the footage with a sinking feeling in her stomach, knowing this was the smoking gun they had been searching for. The truth was about to be exposed, but the officers, oblivious to their mistake, had already set their next move into motion. As soon as the drugs were planted, they knew they had to create a cover story. With the assistance of Captain John Miller, they began to orchestrate a smear campaign aimed directly at Samuel's character. The media was already rabid with interest, and they knew the narrative had to shift. Miller called in favors, leaned on his connections in the local news outlets, and twisted the facts. The message was clear. Samuel Green was a danger to society. He had been caught with illegal drugs in his car. He had abused his power as a judge, and now he was trying to manipulate the system from behind the scenes. The media ran with it. The headlines screamed, "Retired judge arrested for drug possession." The spin was flawless, and for a brief moment, it seemed like Samuel was losing the fight. But Maya wasn't about to let the officers win this round. Within hours, she was on the phone with the media, fighting back against the lies. "This is a carefully orchestrated attack. They planted the evidence," she stated firmly. "The truth will come out, and when it does, there will be no place for them to hide." The media, initially complicit in the smear campaign, began to ask questions. There were inconsistencies in the story, too many gaps, too many contradictions. The public support for Samuel surged again, stronger than before, as more and more people began to realize the depth of the officer's deception. A simple man had been framed for a crime he didn't commit, and the power behind the frame was crumbling under the pressure as the public's fury grew. The officers began to feel the heat. Their lies were unraveling at the seams. But just as things seemed to be shifting in Samuel's favor, the conspiracy deepened. The corruption wasn't just limited to David, Carl, and Captain Miller. It went further, much further. Maya dug deeper, tracing the connections between the officers and the city's powerful elites. It was a web of deceit, a network of criminals in high places, each one desperate to protect their own interests. The more Maya uncovered, the more dangerous this battle became. She wasn't just fighting to free Samuel anymore. She was fighting to take down an entire system built on corruption, lies, and abuse of power. One evening, as Maya sat in her office, surrounded by piles of evidence, her phone rang. It was Samuel. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice calm but tinged with determination. "This isn't just about me. This is bigger than that. We're not just exposing these officers. We're exposing an entire network of corruption that's been operating in plain sight." Maya nodded, her resolve hardening. She had suspected as much. The more she looked into the case, the more she realized how far this went. "I agree," she said, "and it's going to get worse before it gets better. But we can't back down now." "I won't," Samuel replied. "Neither will you." The fight had only just begun. As the weeks went on, Samuel's case continued to grow in prominence. The public's outrage didn't subside. With Maya's help, Samuel fought back against the officers' lies. Video footage of the officers planting the drugs was leaked to the press, and the truth was finally exposed. David, Carl, and Captain Miller were caught in their own web of deceit. But even as their world began to crumble, the corrupt officers remained defiant. They tried to convince themselves they were untouchable. They were wrong. The evidence was overwhelming. And as the investigation expanded, it was clear that the conspiracy within the police force was far more extensive than anyone had anticipated. The real fight for justice was still ahead. Samuel knew it would take everything he had to bring down this corrupt empire, but with Maya by his side and the public support behind him, he wasn't afraid. The road ahead was long, but the truth would win, and they would not rest until it did. The walls were closing in on David White, Carl Brown, and Captain John Miller. Their attempts to erase their tracks had failed, and now they were trapped in a web of lies they could no longer control. The video evidence of the planted drugs had shaken their world to its core. But the fight was far from over. The backlash had been swift, and now Samuel Green's name had become a symbol of the struggle against the deep-rooted corruption within the system. Samuel, locked in that holding cell, had seen more than his fair share of battles, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the thousands of men and women who had been silenced by the very system that was supposed to protect them. And Samuel knew, deep in his bones, that this battle was not just for his freedom. It was for the soul of the justice system itself. Maya Ross, as determined as ever, had become the heart of the fight. She worked tirelessly, pulling every string she could find, using every connection at her disposal. As the legal battle raged on, she kept unearthing more pieces of the puzzle. The corruption went beyond just the officers. The police force was riddled with powerful figures who had manipulated the law for their own benefit, and Samuel was now their target. The deeper Maya dug, the more dangerous the situation became. Late one night, as Maya sat alone in her office, reviewing documents and preparing for the next move, her phone rang. The number wasn't familiar, but she answered it anyway. "Maya," came the voice on the other end, gravelly but unmistakable. "It's Samuel." Maya's heart skipped a beat. There was something in his voice, something she couldn't place. She had never heard him sound this way before, so calm, so sure. "I've been thinking," Samuel continued, "about what's at stake here, about the bigger picture." Maya leaned forward, her hand clutching the phone tighter. "What are you saying, Samuel?" "They've already tried to silence me, Maya. They tried to bury the truth, and now they're trying to use us as pawns in their game. But we have something they don't, the truth." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Maya could almost hear the determination in Samuel's voice. It was a man ready to fight, a man who had spent decades in the courtroom facing the toughest challenges, now using every ounce of his strength to face down this conspiracy. "I'm not backing down," he said, his voice firm. "And I don't expect you to either." Maya took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had fought for justice her whole life, but now the stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about clearing Samuel's name. It was about exposing the rot that had festered for too long. "I'm with you, Samuel. We'll bring them down together." With renewed resolve, Maya set her plan into motion. She wasn't just going to fight in the courts. She was going to take this fight to the streets, to the people who needed to hear the truth. The pressure on the corrupt officers and their powerful allies was mounting. But as Maya soon learned, there were forces at play that went far beyond anything she could have imagined. The next day, as Samuel sat in the courthouse for yet another hearing, a strange feeling washed over him. He had been through countless trials, but this one felt different. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, thick with anticipation. And just as the judge was about to call the session to order, the doors swung open with a loud bang. Maya stormed into the courtroom, her face flushed with urgency. She was holding something in her hands, a thick folder filled with documents. She made a beeline for the defense table, her eyes never leaving the judge. "Your Honor," Maya said, her voice strong and unwavering, "I have new evidence that changes everything." The courtroom fell silent. The tension was palpable, and everyone, both supporters and adversaries alike, leaned forward in anticipation. What Maya held in her hands wasn't just any document. It was the smoking gun that would destroy the officers' lives once and for all. "I've been digging, Your Honor," Maya continued, "and what I found goes beyond just this case. It goes straight to the heart of the corruption in this city's police force." As she spoke, Maya opened the folder and began laying the evidence on the table before the judge. She revealed financial records, emails, and witness testimony, all pointing to a vast network of bribery, extortion, and illegal activity that involved not just David and Carl, but Captain Miller and countless other officers within the precinct. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. This wasn't just about Samuel anymore. This was a scandal of epic proportions, one that could bring down an entire system. As the judge sifted through the documents, his face grew pale. He looked up at the gallery of witnesses and lawyers. I need a moment," he said, his voice shaky. Maya and Samuel exchanged a glance. They could feel it, the shift, the turning of the tide. It wasn't just a matter of law anymore. The truth was breaking through, and there was no going back. But as they watched the judge deliberate, something unexpected happened. The door to the courtroom creaked open once again, and two officers, David and Carl, stepped in, their faces stone cold. They hadn't been expecting this. They hadn't been expecting Maya's evidence to be so thorough, so damning. And in that moment, they knew their days of getting away with their crimes were numbered. But just as the officers began to move to take action, a flash of movement at the back of the courtroom caught Maya's eye. There, in the shadows, was a figure. A man she had never seen before, wearing a dark coat and a fedora. His eyes met hers for a split second before he disappeared into the crowd. A chill ran down Maya's spine. Something wasn't right. The walls were closing in on them, but someone, somewhere, was still pulling the strings. Samuel could feel it too. The calm he had held so tightly was slipping away. He had prepared for this moment, but now, the fight had become even more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The conspiracy was far from over. It was only just beginning. The courtroom was electric with tension. It felt like the entire city was holding its breath. Samuel Green, once a man of quiet dignity in the hallowed halls of the Supreme Court, now sat at the defendant's table, his life turned upside down. The officers, David White, Carl Brown, and their superior, Captain John Miller, sat across from him, their faces hard, their defiance palpable. But today, the odds were no longer in their favor. Maya Ross, who had fought tooth and nail for Samuel's freedom, stood by his side, her eyes steely with determination. The evidence she had uncovered, the video, the financial records, the network of corruption, had shaken the foundations of the police force and the city's power structures. This was supposed to be the day of reckoning, the day the truth would finally come out. Yet, as the trial began, an unsettling realization settled over Samuel's heart. The battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot, as the prosecution laid out their case, detailing the officer's involvement in planting drugs and orchestrating the smear campaign against Samuel. The courtroom was filled with murmurs of disbelief. It was a damning case. But Samuel knew that the men sitting across from him weren't the only ones responsible. There were bigger players behind the scenes, pulling the strings, and sure enough, just as Samuel thought the tide was turning in his favor, the defense unleashed its counterattack. "You see, Your Honor," the defense attorney sneered, "this is nothing more than a desperate attempt by a disgraced judge to save face. There's no evidence linking our clients to these accusations. Just a video, a few documents, and a lot of hearsay. Are we supposed to believe that these men, honorable officers of the law, would risk their careers for some ill-conceived vendetta?" The words cut through the courtroom like a knife. The defense painted Samuel as the villain, suggesting that his accusations were nothing more than the ramblings of an embittered old man. They twisted the narrative, manipulating the truth, and Samuel's stomach churned as they slandered his name. But worse was yet to come. Just as the defense finished its statement, a hush fell over the courtroom as a new, unexpected twist emerged. A figure stepped into the courtroom. It was Judge Ronald Parks, one of Samuel's colleagues from his days on the bench. The judge, a powerful political figure, had been a friend once, but now he stood with an air of suspicion. "I have information that may change the course of this trial," Judge Parks said, his voice cold and deliberate. "Samuel Green has a long history of personal vendettas. The charges against these officers are nothing but a diversion from his own guilt." Gasps echoed through the room. Maya's eyes widened with disbelief as the judge continued. "I have a statement from multiple sources within the judicial system, including several political figures, who confirm that Samuel Green has been manipulating cases for years. This trial is a smokescreen, and we are being used as pawns in his game." The courtroom erupted into chaos. The very person who had once fought for justice was now being accused of corruption. Samuel felt his resolve being tested like never before. His heart pounded in his chest. Could this be the end? Were the forces behind this conspiracy too strong to overcome? Maya immediately stood up, her voice sharp and commanding. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a last-ditch effort to discredit Samuel and derail this trial. Judge Parks is not a neutral party. He's tied to the very people we are fighting against. This is a calculated move to protect the corrupt system that's been running unchecked for years." But the damage had been done. The seeds of doubt had been planted in the minds of the jury. The courtroom was no longer just a place for legal arguments. It had become a battlefield of words, manipulation, and power. Outside the courtroom, Samuel's grandson, Eric, stood at the steps of the courthouse, watching as the media swarmed. Eric's phone was in his hand, the screen filled with messages of support and anger. The public's backing had been strong, but now the narrative had shifted. People were asking questions. Had Samuel been part of the corruption all along? Was he the one pulling the strings, using his position of power to manipulate the system for his own gain? The threat was real. The people who wanted to bury Samuel weren't just after his reputation. They were after everything he had built, everything he had fought for. They knew that if Samuel won, it would mean the end of their reign. And so, they pushed back harder, more viciously than before. Back in the courtroom, the trial raged on. But Maya wasn't about to let this new challenge defeat them. She rallied, presenting evidence that tied Judge Parks to the very network of corruption Samuel had uncovered. His connections to the corrupt officers, his ties to shady political figures, it was all there in black and white. But the emotional toll on Samuel was undeniable. His body ached, and his mind was weary. How many times had he faced these battles, only to come up against more lies, more deceit? The weight of the false accusations, the threat to his legacy, and the jeopardy his family was in. It was overwhelming that as the trial reached its climax, a growing group of supporters rallied around Samuel, determined to expose the full extent of the corruption. Protesters lined the streets, holding signs that read hashtag Justice for Samuel and hashtag End the Corruption. The movement was no longer just about one man's fight for justice. It was about taking down an entire system that had allowed this kind of abuse to fester. Samuel, despite the mounting pressure, remained calm. He knew what he had to do. He had fought too long, too hard to back down now. The lies, the betrayals, they didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the truth that as the final arguments were presented, Samuel stood. His voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. "I am not a perfect man," he began, his eyes meeting those of the jury. "But I have spent my life fighting for justice. I did not come here today to destroy lives. I came here to expose the truth. And if we do nothing, then we are all complicit in the corruption that has seeped into the very core of our system." The room fell silent. Samuel's words hung in the air like a challenge, a call to action. He had given everything: his career, his reputation, his family's safety, and yet he was willing to risk it all for the truth. The jury deliberated, and as they filed back into the courtroom, the tension was unbearable. The world outside was holding its breath, waiting for a verdict that would shape the future. Samuel didn't know what the outcome would be, but one thing was certain: the fight was far from over. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. For days, Samuel Green had fought not just for his freedom, but for the very foundation of justice. The conspiracy that had tried to ruin him was now laid bare. The intricate web of lies and corruption that had been spun around his name slowly unraveling. Today, in this very courtroom, the truth was about to be revealed. Maya Ross, his unyielding lawyer, had presented the final piece of the puzzle. Evidence that directly implicated the corrupt officials who had conspired against Samuel. The media had been clamoring for the story, and as more details emerged, the public's opinion swayed dramatically in Samuel's favor. What had started as a smear campaign to destroy his reputation had now become a rallying cry for justice, a movement that transcended his personal case. People from all walks of life had rallied behind him, from protesters outside the courthouse to legal experts who rallied in support of Samuel's tireless fight. Then, the breakthrough came. Maya stood, holding up a thick stack of documents, the smoking gun that would finally expose the true extent of the conspiracy. Samuel's enemies, David White, Carl Brown, and Captain John Miller, had been caught red-handed in their attempt to manipulate the system. But it wasn't just these three men who were guilty. The conspiracy had deep roots, reaching into the very heart of the political and judicial system. The papers Maya had laid out revealed connections to high-ranking officials, judges, and even political figures. People who had turned a blind eye to corruption for years, allowing it to fester and grow like an unchecked virus. And now it was all coming to light. "The truth is not something that can be hidden forever," Samuel said, standing up slowly. His voice rang with conviction, echoing through the courtroom. "It may take time, but it always comes to the surface. Today, the truth is on trial, and I'm proud to say that we've won." The room fell silent once more, but this time, it was a silence filled with respect. Samuel Green, a man who had been humiliated, beaten, and betrayed, was now standing tall, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been wronged by a corrupt system. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. He had fought the hardest battle of his life, and he had emerged victorious. But as the gavel slammed down, marking the end of this chapter, Samuel couldn't help but feel a bittersweet taste in his mouth. His name had been cleared, and the men who had wronged him were being brought to justice. But the victory felt incomplete. The system, the very system that had allowed this corruption to thrive, was still broken. And there were still so many more battles to be fought. Maya approached him with a triumphant smile, her eyes filled with admiration. "You did it, Samuel," she said, her voice full of pride. "You changed everything." Samuel nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It's not just me, Maya. This is about all of us. About everyone who's ever been silenced by the system. This victory is for them." Eric, his grandson, stood beside him, looking at Samuel with awe. The young man had seen his grandfather endure so much, and yet, through it all, Samuel had remained unbroken. Eric had always known his grandfather was special, but today, in that courtroom, he realized just how powerful his courage was. "You're a legend, Grandpa," Eric said, his voice cracking with emotion. Samuel looked down at his grandson, his heart swelling with pride. "It's not about being a legend, Eric. It's about making sure that when we're gone, we've left behind something better than what we found. And that's what we're doing today." As the trial concluded, Samuel was once again a free man. The charges against him were dropped, and the corrupt officers, along with their co-conspirators, were facing serious consequences. But Samuel knew this was only one step in a much larger journey. The real victory, he realized, wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in the people who had rallied behind him, in the thousands of voices that had called for justice. It was in the awareness that had been raised, the movement that had begun, and the change that was now possible. But as Samuel and his family walked out of the courthouse, surrounded by cheers and applause, he knew this wasn't the end. The fight for justice was far from over. There were more battles to fight, more corruption to expose, and more people to stand up for. Samuel's victory wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a beacon for everyone who had ever felt powerless. "You've changed everything," Maya repeated, a smile on her face as she watched the crowd swell with support. "And you've made people believe in justice again." Samuel nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd. There were people holding signs, chanting for justice, for reform, for change. It was a moment of triumph, yes, but it was also a reminder of how fragile justice could be. The system had failed Samuel once, but today it had worked. "Let's make sure it stays that way," he said quietly, his resolve stronger than ever. And as they made their way through the crowd, a sense of calm washed over Samuel. The journey had been long and painful, but it had been worth it. And now, with his grandson by his side and the support of his legal team, Samuel was ready for whatever came next. The fight against corruption was ongoing, but Samuel knew one thing for sure. The battle for justice had only just begun. Lessons learned. Samuel's journey teaches us a powerful lesson about resilience and the importance of standing up for what's right. No matter how hard the fight or how high the stakes, the truth will always have its day in the light. Corruption, no matter how deeply rooted, can be toppled by those who refuse to stay silent. If you believe in justice, if you believe in standing up for what's right, then Samuel Green's story is a testament to the power of perseverance. Join the movement for justice. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, resilience, and the fight for a better tomorrow. Your support can help us keep pushing forward, exposing corruption, and making a difference in the world. Together, we can continue the fight for justice, just like Samuel Green.